filthy, filthy, hairy hands off mine. Beer, beer, beer.
Okay, so welcome to BeerTengoku, Behind the Beer. This week we've got Molly Brown in from Lallemand Yeast. How are you doing?
Hi, good, yeah. I'm doing well.
The last couple of episodes we focused on malts and hops, and this week we're looking at yeast. Now, Molly, could you tell us a bit about Lallemand and your yeast?
Yeah, so we're a Canadian company, and it's a family-run company, but it's quite a large company in terms of our brewing division is one of several divisions. So we actually have a wine division, a distilling division, pharmaceutical division, plant care. So I work for the brewing side of things, but we do work closely with our oenology, our wine division, and our distilling division as well. But our yeast is made, it's a dried yeast. It's made in Vienna, and except for one strain, which is the Belle Saison, which is made at a different plant because it is a diastaticus strain. So we keep those two separate. And then we also produce, we just came out with a bacteria strain.
Ooh.
A dried bacteria strain it's meant for kettle souring, but I know people have used it in barrels. It's just extremely hop sensitive, so that's just something to be aware of. But that strain is also produced at a different plant. And we offer the yeast in sachets and also in bricks. There's like a variety of quantities that you can go through, but it's an international company, so we sell in Europe, Asia, and I'm the East Coast of the United States rep for us right now.
I've used a couple of your yeasts in the past. I've actually got a couple of yeasts in the fridge. And your range is, maybe some people might say, narrow, but it's a very solid yeast in that whenever I've used it, it's always produced the flavors I've wanted to produce.
Yeah, I think one of the things that differentiates us is, and I was surprised by this, but our R&D and our quality control program is pretty high. So if every batch of yeast will go through quality control checks, and if it doesn't pass, then we don't produce it, we don't sell it. But also on that other end, we do a lot of experimentation with different yeast, and that's where our R&D branch comes in. We can bank different yeast, but we can also do experiments on our own yeast under different forms of stress conditions. So we can say, all right, we add under this pH, for example, if it's extremely low pH, we know, Nottingham should perform pretty well. We know that, BRY should perform all right. Similarly, we were just doing experiments with hydration, and we found that in our lab, our New England strain and our Diamond strain, which are pretty sensitive strains, they're pretty delicate. Theoretically, you would think those would perform better if you hydrated them. And in our lab, our scientists found that the opposite was true, that the lag phase that you normally see with those yeast dropped considerably when they weren't hydrated. So it's all the science that we have, we back it up with the yeast in that sense.
In the process of making yeast, obviously you have the cultures, you grow in a liquid form. How do you get that form into a dry state for homebrewers or brewing companies to use?
Yeah, so our plants, I know about this vaguely. I just joined the team earlier this year, so I'm not 100% an expert on this. Okay. But they go through, they're produced in a wet form, and then they go through a drying process. I think it's sort of similar food dehydration in that sense, but these are large, very sanitized, sterile conditions that they're dried in, and they're dried in, and then they will undergo a QC process after they're dried. So there's a quality check before the drying process and a quality check after. Okay. But I can, that's one thing with our team meeting coming up here in a couple weeks, I'm going to be learning more about that. So that's something that I'm excited to learn about, just from a production standpoint.
It's definitely very interesting. I mean, when you have that packet of dry yeast, and as you said, the rehydration stage is a very important stage. You open it up, put it into water, and it's like 30 minutes of nervousness again. Is this going to work? Is this going to work? Please work. And all of a sudden you get that waft of, okay, it's good. It's a good smell. You mentioned that you have a New England dry yeast. Now, how did you come about to create that strain? Obviously, it's due to the market and the influence of New England IPAs, but how did Lallemand come to develop it, if you don't mind me asking?
That was developed, it came from a Vermont strain, and it was developed basically by us trialing different strains and seeing which one would hold up to the drying conditions, because when the yeast is dried, it does undergo some stress in the sense of it's converting that yeast to store more glycogen and to kind of stay in a homeostasis type of stage. So not all of those New England yeast, I believe, could do that and perform well after that, but this one could. So it was just due to a lot of trial and error. It's the same reason, like that drying process is the same reason why if you have like a kettle sour or something like that, these yeast perform better under those kind of harsh acidic conditions.
So that's one of your newer developments. How has Lallemand responded to previous, how should we say, demands from homebrewers in the brewing market over the last, say, 20 to 30 years?
We listen really well. I mean, we always attend a homebrew con here in the States, but we just have this ongoing thread the past couple months as a company, which we're a pretty small team, to say our brewing division is to say what are the trends coming up, what are homebrewers doing, what are professional brewers looking for, because I mean, me personally, like the New England kind of phase is slowly petering out, but I think a lot of people are really interested in Norwegian style of beers and different hybrids and lagers, of course. So we do like for people, or we do like that feedback. We do like to see what, like after they get a homebrew con, I'm sure my boss and a couple of our sales reps will come back and say, all right, these are what homebrewers are talking about this year. Let's see what we can do on our R&D side. Earlier
on, before this conversation started, we talked about the craft beer conference in the States. What did you pick up from brewers at that conference about yeast?
I think quality is becoming a bit more in the forefront, particularly with saisons and whether or not, it's a diastaticus strain and how we treat diastaticus and things like that. And I think that's a really great conversation to have, because it's elevating people to look at their whole process in terms of, well, just because, like, for example, like a sanitized vessel here doesn't mean like everything is clean in terms of like cross-contamination and things like that. So there was a lot of conversation on that. There was a lot of conversation on just different hybrids coming out and the reaction of brewers to that. I personally had conversations with people talking about GMO and yeast, and a lot of people are really excited about that. It's like a two-way street. Like a lot of brewers are really excited about the possibility of, hey, there could be like a Saccharomyces strain that can acidify beer without, having the contamination of bacteria. So there's a lot of talk on that. I think yeast is kind of one of these things, that there's so much to manipulate to create these really awesome flavors. I think why we're looking to do hybrids coming in, maybe there's a lot of new trends, and I think yeast are kind of leading the way in the trend department, where the flavors can be manipulated, which a lot of brewers who have focused on hops haven't really focused on yeast before. So I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years.
It's definitely interesting. Seeing the States and seeing how the market is developed, going from very hop forward beers with very strong bitter additions, and those additions getting later and later in the boil to almost like, okay, we're going to add God knows how many hops as a whirlpool to create like a full-on aroma. But as you said, perhaps hops have had their time now, and it could be the yeast, which people often forget that without yeast there wouldn't be alcohol.
Right.
And those flavors. Of the yeast types that you have at Lallemand, do you have a particular favorite, or one that stands out for you?
I think there's some that I like to use that are just very versatile. So I think our Nottingham, one things that I've been talking to a lot of people about that I'm personally really excited about, even though I know it's kind of sacrilege, is that our Nottingham strain can ferment at quite low temperatures, lager temperatures, in fact. So I've been talking to a number of breweries about doing, pretty much like fake lagers. So if you're tied up for tank space, this is a way to ferment a beer in a lager-like state, but you're able to turn your tank quicker. You're able to get that fermentation done quicker and still have a clean lager-like beer. Maybe, not as much sulfur. It would clean up diacetyl a little bit more. So I think that's been really interesting to me, and also maybe combining both of those, like the lager, like our Diamond and our Nottingham. I also recently discovered, and I said this to a friend of mine's brewery in Michigan, the New England strain and our lager strain, the Diamond, kind of overlap in terms of temperature profile. So I kind of challenged him to use both yeast in a batch of beer and see what would happen. Maybe, I don't know what would happen, but I think it would be kind of cool to do a beer that kind of brings the best out of both worlds of those two strains.
It sounds interesting. You do have smash beers, the single malt, single hops, but it would be definitely interesting to see how the different yeast, you have the same base, the same hops, but how the yeast would affect that beer in terms of flavour.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. This is actually a question from a reader, a guy called Jeremy, and he, from what I've seen, he's very fond of creating his own slants and harvesting yeast. Do you have any advice for someone getting into harvesting yeast or slants from dry yeast?
Yeah, you obviously can. What would be probably the most practical idea is to ferment a beer with the dried yeast, and then from that take the slurry, because especially here in the States there's that misnomer of, oh, you can't harvest from dried yeast. You can. I know many breweries that go multiple generations with our yeast.
Wow.
But in that liquid state you're able to select colonies. Obviously you need a microscope, you need like a flame, dishes, because what you're doing is you're selecting cells to hold on to a slant and then storing them at a very, very cold temperature. But my advice would be, put it in a liquid state, in the sense of brew a beer with it, brew a low gravity beer with it, and then either harvest directly and like go cone to cone or whatever, or harvest to a brink and then use that brink, and within like a week you can do it that way. Long-term storage is the slant storage. If you want to go through all that time and money, I personally, depending how big you are, I only know of really big breweries that do slants, just because it's more cost effective just to buy a new pitch. But for larger breweries, using a massive amount of yeast, having a slant, having a fresh culture is beneficial for them.
If someone was to just get into home brewing, personally, I always recommend dry yeast. It's very easy for them just to open a packet up. But which of your yeasts would you recommend for a beginner home brewer?
I would say the Nottingham is one of our, pretty much all of our yeasts are pretty bulletproof. The Nottingham and the BRY, in terms of ale yeast, they can pitch it in. You really don't need to hydrate these yeasts unless you're really going to stress them out in terms of a very high gravity brew, or you're severely under pushing maybe. I think those two yeasts, you can, with all the yeast, you feel pretty confident it's going to work. But if you're just a home brewer and you don't really know a lot about aeration or temperature control, particularly the Nottingham, has a very wide temperature range. So I feel like you could be pretty confident going, all right, I may not have aerated this correctly, or I may not have great temperature control on my fermenter or my carboy, but it will still work.
I'll have to try that out. I do have I think I've got a Nottingham in my fridge. I don't have your West Coast, actually. I didn't know you made a West Coast dry yeast until you said that.
Yep, that's the BRY. So we have a West Coast yeast and we have a East Coast yeast, and now we just need a Midwest right now. All the regions.
This is a question I've just literally just thought because you just mentioned it. Is there such thing as a Midwest IPA?
There isn't, but I was recently, all right. Personally, to me, there isn't. Two Hearted probably is a Midwest IPA. But that being said, I was in Wisconsin a couple months ago, and I picked up Moon Man from New Glarus. And on the can, it's very well done. It's a gorgeous beer. I love Moon Man. But they basically declare on the can, Deb and Dan Carey, this is a no-coast ale beer. This IPA, this pale ale, really doesn't belong to either coast.
Okay.
It's just a great beer. And I was like, I love that, because a lot of people, especially if they're opening up breweries and they don't have an idea of what they want to brew, they get tied to these styles of hazy equals New England. And it doesn't. I was brewing hazy beers years before this New England craze. They were unfiltered because we had a philosophy as a company, the company I worked for, to make as natural beers as we could, as minimally processed beers as we could. Some of those beers were a little bit cloudy. They weren't milkshake cloudy, but they were a nice sort of haze in there. But that was backed by the philosophy of the company. I think you can make really great beer and not have to be so focused on it has to be this kind of color or this kind of haze, or it has to be completely clear. I think it should be dictated by what you want the flavor and the aroma of the beer to taste like at the end.
Well, that is true, definitely. I mean, with the yeast, as you say, it's if you know what flavor it's going to be, you have that prediction, don't you? And you can go, dink, this is what it's going to taste like. Obviously, in the States, again, it's not so much in Japan, not so much in Europe, but there's been a lot of takeovers of craft breweries.
Yeah.
How has that affected Lallemand, or how do you see it affecting you in the future, or the industry?
It hasn't really affected us too much. We just kind of sit back and watch. It's affected, this is a very hot topic here in the States, obviously. And what it was, and I think this has all died down in terms of takeovers. Like, you haven't seen anybody being bought in the past year. It's a distribution fight in the States more than anything. It's a fight over shelf space. So right now, a lot of these small brewers, they're not interested in that. They're benefiting from self-distribution laws in the States and having their own tap room. But the larger regional brewers, this is where you're seeing, like, Deschutes, for example, pull out of Virginia or kind of like stall that project for a while, or the trouble with Green Flash and how they had to, sell their Virginia brewery. You're fighting for a limited amount of shelf space in a footprint that you already have a wide footprint. So I think the trend, and the more sustainable trend, is going to be breweries focusing on their own tap rooms. And we'll see what that next wave is like when these breweries that have tap rooms now, where is their end goal? Do they want to expand and distribute throughout their state, or do they want to be like a couple states or just in their city? That's going to be the up and coming question. But for a yeast supplier, it's kind of great because, we're like, I'm in sales, but I'm also more of a technical, I come from production backgrounds, here more to answer your questions than to sell you this yeast, or I'm here to try to figure out like how we can help you. And a lot of these breweries, especially a lot of these smaller breweries, are finding, it's much more economical just to go with a dried yeast that you can purchase, you can run through how many generations you need to. You have that safety of knowing it's going to work.
Like I said, you can get some of your yeast from inside of Japan, I do believe. They've got a small supply of your products, and I think you said you're coming over in August. Can we expect some more of your yeast in Japan in the future?
Yeah, we're working on it. That's kind of one of our main goals of this trip. It's me and my boss coming over, promote the yeast, and kind of get our products out there. Japan, as it's been reminded of me, and I tend to forget this. It does suffer from home brewing being in a difficult state there legally, so we have to find some creative ways to get around that. Maybe, I don't know. So we're kind of, me and my boss are in conversation with our distributor about that. But yeah, we definitely want to make our yeast more accessible to everybody, of course.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry.
It's been definitely very, very informative about dry yeast. For me, like I said, it's great just to be able to reach into the fridge, take the packet out, half hour later, boom, ready, and it makes brew days a lot easier.
For sure.
So thank you
very
very much.